The fastest way to discover who really owns a place is to watch what happens when the real owner comes home. The first thing I noticed was not the open front door. It was the silence. Every beach cabin has its own soundtrack. Waves folding gently onto the sand. Seagulls arguing overhead. Wind brushing through sea oats until they whisper against the weathered deck railing. That afternoon, all of those familiar sounds were still there, but something felt wrong. Even before I stepped onto the wooden boardwalk leading to my cabin, I saw cardboard boxes sitting on the porch where I had never left them. My tackle box rested beside a rocking chair that belonged inside. A framed photograph of my grandparents leaned awkwardly against the wall, catching the afternoon sunlight. Someone had been moving my things. I slowed my pace, the salt air filling my lungs as the smell of fresh ocean water mixed with newly cut lumber from a nearby construction project. My fishing gear rested over one shoulder, and the shotgun I had legally transported back from an early morning waterfowl hunting trip remained secured on my other shoulder exactly as it had been the entire drive home. I had not even reached the front steps before 3 people, wearing matching polo shirts embroidered with the Neighborhood Association logo, walked out of my cabin carrying another storage box. One of them stopped so suddenly that a roll of blue painter's tape slipped from his hand and bounced across the porch. Another looked at me, then at the cabin, then back at me again with complete confidence. "Sir," he said, "this property is under association control now. You need to leave." For a second, I honestly wondered whether they had confused my cabin with another one farther down the shoreline. Then I noticed my welcome mat folded in half beside the door and my old brass key lying on the porch table exactly where I always left it before locking up. They had not mistaken anything. They believed they belonged there. I quietly set my fishing cooler on the deck without saying a word. As I adjusted the strap on my shoulder to make myself more comfortable after the long walk from the beach, the secured shotgun became more visible. I never lifted it. I never touched it beyond settling the weight naturally after hours outdoors. The change in their expressions happened almost instantly. The confidence disappeared. One man carefully placed the box back on the porch. Another stepped backward toward the driveway while glancing at the others. Nobody shouted. Nobody argued. The woman leading the group reached for a folder tucked beneath her arm, as though suddenly unsure whether any of the papers inside meant what she had been told they meant. Within moments, they were walking briskly away from the cabin, speaking to each other in hurried whispers I could not quite hear over the crashing surf. One of them accidentally left a clipboard behind. I stood there watching them disappear down the boardwalk, more confused than angry. If they truly believed they had legal authority, why leave so quickly? I picked up the forgotten clipboard and noticed several pages filled with inspection notes, handwritten measurements, and a checklist titled Property Transition. At the bottom sat a signature line that had never been signed. I looked toward the horizon where the late afternoon sun reflected across the Atlantic like polished glass, then back at the open front door of the cabin my grandfather built almost 50 years earlier. At that moment, I knew this was no misunderstanding. Someone had convinced those people that my family's beach cabin belonged to them, and before the tide came in that evening, I intended to find out exactly who had started the lie. My name is Mason Carter, and the little beach cabin sitting on the edge of the Atlantic has been part of my family longer than I have been alive. My grandfather built it with his own hands almost 50 years ago when this stretch of shoreline was nothing more than seagrass, weathered dunes, and a handful of fishing shacks connected by narrow wooden walkways. He always said the ocean had a way of reminding people that nothing truly belonged to them forever except the memories they chose to protect. When he passed the cabin down to me, he did not leave behind a fortune. He left a place where every creaking floorboard, every salt-stained window, and every faded photograph carried a story. I never treated it like a vacation rental or an investment. It was simply home whenever I needed to slow down and remember what mattered. Most mornings began before sunrise. I would wake to the sound of waves rolling onto the beach below the dunes while the smell of salt air drifted through the screened windows. Coffee always tasted different there, somehow richer with the ocean breeze mixing into the steam. After breakfast, I usually carried my fishing rods down the wooden boardwalk, watching pelicans skim low across the water while dolphins occasionally surfaced beyond the breakers. During waterfowl season, I also enjoyed legal hunting activities in approved public areas before returning directly to the cabin, carefully transporting my equipment according to state law. That routine had become so ordinary I rarely thought about it anymore. The old brass key stayed on the same hook beside the back door. Security cameras quietly recorded every entrance, every section of the porch, and the path leading from the beach. I installed them years earlier after a tropical storm damaged part of the property and contractors needed regular access while repairs were underway. They eventually became just another part of the cabin, as unnoticed as the weather vane spinning above the roof. The cabin itself stood slightly apart from the newer luxury homes that had appeared farther down the shoreline over the past decade. Those houses belonged to an upscale coastal development with carefully maintained landscaping, matching exterior colors, decorative fencing, and a homeowners association that seemed to grow more influential every year. My property, however, had never been included. The original deed had been recorded decades before the development existed, and every county record confirmed that the cabin remained entirely independent. I never had a problem with my neighbors. Most were friendly, waved when they passed, and occasionally stopped to ask how the fishing had been. I always answered with a smile because life felt too peaceful beside the ocean to waste on unnecessary arguments. Looking back now, I realized the signs had been there long before I noticed them. Survey flags appeared near the edge of the dunes for reasons nobody explained. Expensive sport utility vehicles slowed whenever they passed my driveway. Strangers occasionally photographed my cabin from the public boardwalk before quickly leaving when they saw me outside. I assumed they admired the view. I never imagined they were studying the last property on the shoreline that refused to fit neatly inside someone else's master plan. If I had understood what those quiet observations were leading toward, I might have opened the security camera recordings much sooner. Instead, I simply enjoyed another peaceful season by the water, completely unaware that while I was protecting my family's traditions, someone else had already started making plans for my family's cabin. I first met Diane Whitmore during a community shoreline cleanup that I attended simply because I believed everyone should help keep the beach clean, whether they belonged to an association or not. She introduced herself with a polished smile, a perfectly pressed navy blazer despite the warm coastal breeze, and the kind of confidence that made every conversation sound less like a discussion and more like a decision that had already been made. Diane served as president of the Seabreeze Cove Homeowners Association, an organization that managed nearly every property along the coast except mine. At first, she seemed friendly enough. She complimented my grandfather's cabin, admired its weathered cedar siding, and even asked about the history of the old fishing photographs hanging inside. Then, almost casually, she asked whether I had ever considered joining the association. I thanked her politely and explained that my property had never been part of the development, that it remained under its original deed, and that I preferred keeping things exactly as my family had always maintained them. Her smile remained, but something behind it quietly changed. Over the following months, I began noticing small differences that most people would have ignored. Association newsletters appeared inside my mailbox even though they were addressed to neighboring properties. Volunteers occasionally left brochures on my porch describing architectural standards, landscaping requirements, and upcoming inspections that did not legally apply to my cabin. Once, I returned from an afternoon of fishing to find a small plastic marker pushed into the sand near the edge of my property line with bright paint identifying a future landscape review area. I removed it, assuming someone had made an honest mistake. A week later, another one appeared several feet closer to my deck. Diane always seemed remarkably well informed about changes happening around my cabin. During conversations with neighbors, she referred to my property as the last unfinished corner of the shoreline, describing it as the missing piece that prevented the community from achieving a unified coastal appearance. Most residents simply nodded because they had no reason to question what she said. They had purchased homes inside the association and naturally trusted the people elected to manage it. I never blamed them. They were good neighbors who waved when they walked their dogs, recommended local seafood restaurants, and offered to collect my mail whenever I traveled. The problem was never the families living there. The problem was the growing belief among a handful of board members that every attractive piece of coastline should eventually fall under their control. One afternoon I watched from my porch as Diane stood with several board members studying a large property map spread across the hood of a parked sport utility vehicle. Every few moments someone pointed toward my cabin, then toward the surrounding beach access paths. They folded the map before I could walk over, greeted me with friendly smiles, and drove away as though nothing unusual had happened. Looking back now, I realized they were never interested in getting to know me. They were studying boundaries, access routes, and possibilities. To them, my cabin was not a family legacy shaped by decades of memories, ocean tides, and quiet mornings. It was an obstacle sitting exactly where they believed their authority should eventually extend, and they had already begun convincing themselves that ownership was simply the final detail left to solve. The first official letter arrived by certified mail on a calm Thursday morning, while the tide was still low enough for sandpipers to dart across the wet shoreline. I signed for the envelope, carried it inside, and opened it beside the same kitchen table where my grandfather used to repair fishing reels. The letter informed me that my property had allegedly fallen under newly interpreted community oversight and invited me to attend a compliance meeting regarding exterior standards. I read every page twice before quietly filing it away. My deed had not changed. Neither had the county records. A few weeks later another notice appeared, this time requesting that I repaint the cabin to match the association's approved coastal color palette. After that came a reminder about landscaping requirements, followed by a warning that my weathered wooden deck supposedly violated community appearance guidelines. Every letter assumed I was already part of an organization I had never joined. I answered each one politely, enclosing copies of the recorded deed and the county parcel map confirming that my property remained entirely separate from the development. At first I believed that would settle the misunderstanding. Instead, the letters became more frequent. Contractors began stopping near my driveway asking whether I had scheduled inspections I knew nothing about. Decorative survey flags appeared along the edge of my dunes before disappearing a day later. One afternoon I returned from buying groceries to find a temporary notice attached to my front railing announcing an upcoming association property review. I removed it and placed it inside a folder with the other correspondence, deciding it was wiser to keep everything than to throw anything away. My security cameras quietly captured every visit without drawing attention to themselves. I rarely checked the recordings because nothing seemed serious enough to justify spending hours reviewing ordinary activity. Looking back, that decision almost allowed the situation to grow much worse. The following month, I noticed unfamiliar vehicles driving slowly past the cabin several times a week. They never stopped for long. Someone would step out, look toward the porch, make a few notes on a clipboard, then leave. One evening, while watching the sunset from my deck, I counted the same dark sport utility vehicle passing 3 separate times within an hour. It finally parked near the public beach access, where 2 people unfolded what looked like a property map before pointing toward my cabin and the surrounding dunes. By the time I walked in their direction, they had already packed everything away and driven off. My neighbors remained friendly throughout all of it. Several even apologized for the increasing activity, explaining that the association had become unusually focused on future shoreline planning. Most of them assumed my cabin would eventually become part of the neighborhood through a voluntary agreement. When I explained that I had no intention of selling or joining the association, they seemed genuinely surprised. Apparently, rumors had been circulating that negotiations were already underway. That was the moment I realized someone had been telling a story that never involved me. A few days later, I left before sunrise for a fishing trip followed by a lawful waterfowl hunt in a nearby public area, expecting to return before late afternoon just as I always did. The ocean was calm, the weather was clear, and nothing about the morning suggested that by the time I came home, strangers would be standing inside my family's cabin acting as though they had every right to decide what stayed and what was taken away. When I finally stepped inside the cabin after the 3 association representatives hurried away, I did not chase them or call after them. I simply closed the front door, set my fishing gear against the wall, safely secured the shotgun inside the locked storage cabinet, where it always went after returning from any lawful hunting trip, and stood quietly in the middle of the living room. The place looked as though someone had tried to reorganize a lifetime without understanding what any of it meant. My grandfather's framed photographs had been stacked against the fireplace. Kitchen cabinets stood open. Labels made from blue painter's tape marked shelves with words like approved storage and remove. A cardboard box labeled personal effects sat beside the couch, filled with books, family albums, and old fishing journals that should never have been touched. I picked up the forgotten clipboard from the porch and carried it to the dining table. Attached to it was a checklist describing exterior inspections, inventory notes, and preparation for what they called a property transition. Several pages included handwritten comments referencing association standards, replacement locks, and scheduled contractor access. None of the forms contained a county seal, a court order, or my signature. They looked official at first glance, but the more carefully I read them, the more obvious it became that someone had confused internal association paperwork with actual legal authority. I walked over to the security monitor mounted inside a hallway closet and began reviewing the recordings from earlier that afternoon. The cameras captured everything with remarkable clarity. A dark sport utility vehicle arrived shortly after noon. Diane Whitmore stepped out first, speaking confidently while pointing toward my cabin. 3 association representatives unloaded boxes, clipboards, and new door hardware before walking onto my porch without hesitation. One of them held up several printed pages and announced that the property was now under community management. Another began removing decorative items from the walls while a third carried empty boxes inside. They measured windows, photographed every room, placed colored stickers on furniture, and even discussed repainting the exterior before the next tourist season. What surprised me most was not their confidence. It was how casually they behaved, as though they truly believed they had every right to be there. Then the recording reached the moment I returned. My truck appeared in the driveway. I stepped onto the boardwalk carrying my fishing equipment with the securely slung shotgun still resting over my shoulder exactly as it had been throughout the trip home. The instant they noticed me, the entire mood changed. Nobody approached. Nobody issued another instruction. Diane looked from me to the equipment on my shoulder, then quickly glanced around the porch before quietly telling everyone it was time to leave. Within less than a minute, they gathered what they could, accidentally leaving behind the clipboard, several inspection forms, and one unopened box of replacement locks. Watching the recording confirmed what I had sensed in the moment. They had not left because anyone threatened them. They left because they suddenly realized they were standing inside someone else's home without the legal authority they believed they had. I saved multiple backup copies of every camera angle before calling my attorney. As the evening sun settled over the Atlantic and waves rolled steadily onto the shore outside my windows, I realized the strongest evidence in this entire dispute had been quietly recording the truth long before anyone expected it would ever be needed. The next morning my attorney, Daniel Brooks, arrived carrying a leather briefcase and a portable hard drive instead of dramatic promises. We sat together at the old dining table while sunlight spilled through the salt-stained windows and the steady rhythm of the Atlantic rolled across the beach outside. I handed him the clipboard, the inspection forms, the replacement lock they had left behind, and copies of every letter the association had mailed over the past several months. Then we watched the security footage from beginning to end without interrupting it once. Daniel leaned back quietly after the final recording ended and folded his hands across the table. He said something I had been hoping to hear since this whole mess began. The evidence was speaking for itself. There was no need to exaggerate anything because the cameras had documented every important moment in perfect sequence. They showed the association representatives entering private property without my permission, handling personal belongings, discussing changes to the cabin, and presenting paperwork that carried no legal authority over my land. Most importantly, the recordings also showed exactly what happened when I returned. I never made threats. I never raised my voice. I simply came home after a lawful day outdoors carrying equipment that had remained safely secured during transport until it was immediately stored away once I entered my cabin. Their decision to leave was entirely their own. That distinction mattered because facts often become much stronger when they remain uncomplicated. Daniel contacted the County Property Records Office that same afternoon and requested certified copies of every recorded deed, subdivision plat, shoreline survey, and parcel description connected to my cabin. 2 days later, we met at the county courthouse where a senior records clerk patiently walked us through documents dating back nearly half a century. Every page confirmed the same simple truth. My grandfather had purchased the property years before the coastal development even existed. The homeowners association boundaries stopped well short of my lot, and no amendment, annexation, easement, or recorded agreement had ever changed that fact. The cabin had never belonged to the association, and it had never been subject to its rules. Daniel organized every certified record beside printed still images from the security cameras, creating a timeline that left almost nothing open to interpretation. Later that week, the county sheriff's office accepted copies of the recordings along with the supporting property documents and opened a report concerning the unauthorized entry. The deputy who reviewed everything remained calm and professional, explaining that ownership questions are settled by recorded documents rather than assumptions or internal association paperwork. Hearing those words lifted a weight I had been carrying since I first found my belongings stacked on the porch. News traveled quickly through the shoreline community. Neighbors who had believed the rumors began stopping by to apologize for believing that my cabin was somehow being absorbed into the development. Several admitted they had been told the transition had already been approved. None of them had ever seen the county records. As the evening tide rolled in beneath a sky painted orange and deep blue, I replaced my grandfather's photographs on the wall, returned every fishing journal to its proper shelf, and hung the old brass key back on its familiar hook beside the back door. The cabin finally felt like home again, but this time I knew the quiet would not last much longer because the truth had finally begun moving through official channels, and unlike rumors, official records never forget where the real property line begins. Daniel believed the strongest cases are usually the quietest ones because they rely on records instead of emotions. Rather than demanding public apologies or rushing into interviews, we submitted every piece of evidence through the proper legal channels and allowed the facts to move at their own pace. Certified copies of the property records, the original deed, the recorded subdivision maps, and the security footage all became part of one carefully organized timeline. A few days later, the association's attorney contacted Daniel, requesting a meeting before any additional proceedings moved forward. We met inside a conference room overlooking the county marina, where sailboats drifted gently against floating docks under a bright afternoon sky. Diane Whitmore arrived with 2 board members and their legal counsel. She looked far different from the confident woman who had once stood outside my cabin pointing toward imagined authority. Her expression remained professional, but the certainty had disappeared. Daniel connected a laptop to the conference room monitor and quietly played the security footage from beginning to end. Nobody interrupted. The recording showed every arrival, every conversation, every inspection sticker placed on my belongings, every attempt to organize property that had never belonged to the association. Then the footage reached the moment I returned from my lawful outdoor activities. It clearly showed me walking calmly toward my own cabin carrying my equipment exactly as anyone returning home would. It also showed that I made no threatening movements, gave no commands, and never attempted to confront anyone physically. The representatives simply recognized that they were standing on private property without proper authority and chose to leave immediately. When the video ended, the room remained silent for several long seconds. Daniel then placed the certified county maps beside the monitor and carefully traced the subdivision boundary with a pen. The line stopped well before reaching my cabin. He laid the original deed beside it, followed by the recorded shoreline survey completed decades before the development had ever been approved. Every document confirmed the same conclusion. My cabin had always remained outside the association. There had never been a legal transfer, annexation, or agreement placing it under their control. Diane slowly opened one of her folders and removed several internal planning documents that referred to my property as a future community asset. She looked at them for a moment before quietly setting them aside without another word. Their attorney finally acknowledged what the evidence had made impossible to deny. Internal planning assumptions could never replace recorded ownership. The meeting ended without raised voices or dramatic arguments. Instead, both attorneys discussed practical solutions. The association agreed to withdraw every notice previously sent to my address, cancel all claimed violations, and formally recognize that my property remained entirely independent. They also agreed that future communications concerning my cabin would cease unless I initiated them myself. As I walked out of the marina building, the ocean breeze carried the familiar scent of saltwater across the parking lot, and gulls circled lazily above the harbor. For the first time in months, I felt the tension slowly leaving my shoulders. The greatest surprise was not that the truth had prevailed. It was how quickly certainty collapsed once every assumption had to stand beside actual evidence. My grandfather used to tell me that tides eventually reveal whatever the water tries to hide. Standing there beside the marina, watching sunlight dance across the waves, I realized the same thing could be said about the truth once enough patience allows it to surface. Within 2 weeks, the agreement reached during the meeting had been put into writing. Every notice the association had previously mailed to my cabin was formally withdrawn, and a signed letter acknowledged that my property had never fallen within the boundaries of the development. Daniel encouraged me to keep copies of every document alongside the original deed, not because he expected another dispute, but because complete records often prevent future misunderstandings before they begin. The county property office also updated its public reference file with additional boundary documentation so anyone researching the shoreline parcels would immediately see that my cabin remained independent from the neighboring community. The process was quiet, almost ordinary, yet it carried more weight than any dramatic courtroom victory ever could. News spread quickly through the beach community. Several neighbors stopped by with homemade desserts, fresh seafood, and simple apologies. They admitted they had believed the association's explanations because they had never imagined anyone would confidently claim authority over property that was never included in the development. We spent long evenings sitting on my deck watching the sunset paint the Atlantic in shades of orange and gold while laughing about fishing stories instead of legal paperwork. Those conversations reminded me that good neighbors are built through honesty, not regulations. A month later, the association elected a new board after many homeowners asked for greater transparency regarding future decisions. Diane attended the final meeting as a resident rather than as president. I happened to see her afterward while walking along the public beach access carrying a small tackle box before sunrise. She approached quietly, paused for a moment, and apologized for allowing assumptions to replace verification. She admitted the board had relied on internal planning documents without confirming the original county records. I accepted her apology because holding on to resentment would never restore the peaceful mornings my grandfather loved. What mattered was that the truth had finally replaced the rumor. Over the following weeks, I restored everything inside the cabin exactly where it belonged. The family photographs returned above the fireplace. My grandfather's fishing journals went back onto their familiar shelf beside the weathered compass he carried for years. The old brass key returned to its hook near the back door, where it had quietly waited through every chapter of the story. I also upgraded the camera storage system so future recordings would automatically create secure backup copies without requiring any extra effort. Not because I expected another incident, but because preserving the truth is often easier than reconstructing it later. Visitors still stop to admire the cabin, and I always enjoy telling them about its history. The cedar boards weathered by decades of ocean wind, and the generations who found peace there long before luxury homes lined the shoreline. The ocean itself has not changed. Every morning the waves still roll across the sand with the same steady rhythm. The gulls still circle above the dunes, and the salt air still carries the scent of memories that cannot be measured on any property survey. Looking across the water one quiet evening, I realized the greatest victory had never been proving someone else was wrong. It had been protecting something my family entrusted to me without sacrificing patience, dignity, or respect for the law. The cabin remained exactly what it had always been, not because I argued the loudest, but because the truth had been carefully preserved long before anyone tried to rewrite it. Nearly a year has passed since that afternoon, yet every time I unlock the front door of the cabin, I still pause for just a second before stepping inside. Not because I expect another surprise, but because I appreciate something I once took for granted. Peace has a way of feeling ordinary until someone tries to take it from you. These days my mornings have returned to the simple routine my grandfather loved so much. I wake before sunrise, brew a pot of coffee, open the screened windows, and let the scent of salt air drift through the rooms, while waves roll steadily onto the beach below the dunes. The same wooden deck still creaks beneath my boots. The same gulls still circle above the shoreline searching for breakfast. The same brass key still hangs beside the back door, polished smooth by decades of careful hands. Only now I understand why my grandfather insisted on keeping every deed, every survey, every faded receipt, and every handwritten note neatly organized inside old file boxes. He was never collecting paper. He was preserving the truth. From time to time visitors ask about the security cameras mounted beneath the roofline. I usually smile and tell them they quietly watch over a family history that deserves to be remembered. The cameras remain there, not because I live in fear, but because experience taught me that facts become far more valuable when they are preserved instead of reconstructed. My attorney once told me that the strongest evidence is often the evidence nobody expects to need. Looking back, those cameras never created justice. They simply recorded it waiting to be discovered. The shoreline community feels different now as well. New board members focus on serving the neighborhood rather than expanding their authority, and the conversations that once centered on control have slowly shifted toward cooperation. Neighbors still stop by carrying fresh seafood, homemade pies, or simply a friendly wave while walking along the beach. Some of them laugh about how unbelievable the entire situation sounded once the county records became public. Others admit the experience reminded them to verify facts before believing confident opinions. I think that lesson may be worth even more than the legal documents themselves. One quiet evening, I carried my grandfather's old fishing chair onto the deck and watched the sun disappear beneath the horizon. The ocean reflected streaks of gold and deep blue while a gentle breeze carried the familiar scent of sea salt through the weathered cedar walls. I rested my hand on the old brass key hanging beside the doorway and realized it had quietly connected every chapter of this story. It unlocked the cabin when my grandfather first built it. It welcomed me home after countless fishing trips. It remained exactly where I left it while strangers mistakenly believed they could decide the future of my family's home. In the end, the key never represented a lock. It represented ownership, responsibility, and trust passed from one generation to the next. I never wanted revenge. I never wanted anyone to lose. I only wanted the truth to stand where it had always belonged. My grandfather used to tell me that the ocean has endless patience because every wave eventually reaches the shore. I finally understand what he meant. Justice does not always arrive quickly, and it rarely arrives loudly, but when it is built on truth, careful preparation, and respect for the law, it reaches exactly where it is supposed to, leaving behind something far more valuable than victory. It leaves behind peace that nobody can honestly question again.